Well, welcome to another episode of the Scriptural Mormonism podcast. I'm your host, Robert Boylan. Today, we actually have a new guest today. We are interviewing Jacob Mayberry. So thanks for agreeing to come on to the podcast today, Jacob.
Thanks for having me.
Before we delve into the topic, perhaps if you were to give an introduction to yourself, like have you always been a Latter-day Saint? What got you interested in your various areas of study and so forth?
Yeah, so I was born into the church. I'm from a small town called St. David, Arizona. Has like 2,000 people in it. However, it was settled by members of the church. Brigham Young sent people down to settle Arizona, and this little town was one of them. My ancestors actually helped settle it, and it's called St. David because it's named after David Patton. He was one of the original Quorum of the 12. He got killed in the Battle of Crooked River in Missouri. And so, yeah, I was born into the church. My ancestors have been in the church for a while. I'm currently living in Utah, Magna, Utah. I'm a corrections officer at the Utah State Prison, the new one that just opened over by the airport. And I have a bachelor's degree in psychology from BYU. And I got a master's degree in criminal justice from Liberty University. And I'm currently working on my PhD in criminal justice as well. And I got involved in apologetics in the church. Like I was very fond of reading stuff about apologetics from a scriptural point of view, a historical point of view, but I came to notice that there wasn't much work being done from a social scientific point of view, which I thought was kind of weird because there's a lot of attacks coming from that point of view, saying that the church causes harm, we're all depressed, we're all secretly addicted to pornography, just a bunch of ridiculous stuff that the more research I've done is just it's just most of it is bogus. And I've come to find that members of the church, critics of the church, they're not very well informed on these subjects. Like a lot of critics, they'll delve into the history, they'll delve into the doctrine, they'll delve into Book of Mormon apologetics, and even though like their engagement with is pretty disingenuous, they're still pretty knowledgeable, more knowledgeable than the average member. You got like Jeremy Reynolds and John Dehlin. They probably know more than your average member. But when it comes to from a social scientific point of view, they're just spreading a lot of bogus, and I'll get into that in my presentation. But I just noticed that there was a lot of neglect on that area of research.
In fact, not too long ago, you actually had a debate on Jacob Hanson's platform with a former Latter-day Saint who's now a member of Apologia Church. I'll include a link to the debate in the show notes, but it was entitled, "Is Mormonism Bad for Mental Health?" And I think it was pretty much agreed that you were well prepared for the debate, and I think he even admitted he wasn't actually well prepared, so it didn't go down well for the anti-LDS side. But I'll include a link anyway to the in the show notes to that debate. He presented a lot of interesting information.
We got into like a spat in some Christianity versus Mormonism Facebook page, and he was being really belligerent, and so I just challenged him to a debate. And I knew he wasn't really well prepared. I just wanted to get the information out there and find a platform with a large enough following that enough people would see it. And so I would have been fine with just doing a presentation, but the debate was fun too.
And speaking of presentations, you're going to be providing us with a presentation on mental health and Latter-day Saints. So if you want to take it away, I'll let you do that.
Yeah, for sure. And just sharing my screen real quick. Okay. So my presentation is on mental health and the Latter-day Saints. There's been a good deal of research on this subject. But what got me started in this, I guess what planted the seed for this was growing up. I remember hearing that Utah was the number one state in pornography consumption. I heard this from critics and during from my own church during Fifth Sunday discussions about the dangers of pornography. We had a lot of Fifth Sunday discussions with the priesthood, especially about how Utah is the number one pornography consumer. And I remember thinking, like, that's weird. That didn't ring true to me. But I would also often see claims in the Mormon blogosphere about how Utah had extremely high depression rates, antidepressant use, suicide rates. It would be assumed that these problems were because of the LDS Church and the perfectionistic culture that the church creates. But none of these accusations rang true to me, but I was just a high school kid. I didn't have the knowledge or tools to challenge them. But eventually I ended up coming across these more and more on the internet. And so I started digging into those claims to see if they were true or not. Before I actually get into the research, I'd like to address this from like more of a philosophical or conceptual level, because we often, Latter-day Saints and our critics, operate on different definitions of the word harm. And so that this word right here is central to the critics' arguments, is that the church causes harm. Now, when I was getting my bachelor's degree in psychology from BYU, Ed Gant was one of my professors, and he was really good at tackling the assumptions behind modern psychotherapy and psychology from a philosophical point of view, and really just turning it on its head. And so the critics, what I've come to notice is that their definition of harm is based upon hedonism. And hedonism is all about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain as much as possible. And this comes from the fathers of modern psychotherapy, such as Albert Ellis and Carl Rogers. And this quote is from Dr. Gant's paper in 2003 entitled Hedonism, Suffering, and Redemption, The Challenge of Christian Psychotherapy, from the Brigham Young University Studies. And he says, contemporary psychology's conception of suffering is very much at odds with the understanding provided by modern and ancient revelation, and is thus for Latter-day Saints deeply problematic both intellectually and spiritually. Though seldom explicitly acknowledged, many of the theories and practices of modern psychotherapy are undergirded with a philosophy of hedonism. That is to say, much of the modern psychotherapeutic enterprise is informed by the doctrine that pleasure is the good, and that the maximizing of individual pleasure is what we ought to pursue. One result of this commitment is hedonism in psychology, is that human emotion, psychological, and moral suffering are often regarded only as obstacles to our attainment of happiness and the good life. Indeed, many in contemporary psychology hold that suffering is tragically pointless and unnecessary, the unpleasant byproduct of some impersonal pathological process, defect of rationality, or biochemical deficiency. As such, it is without intrinsic meaning and is seen as some sort of absurdity. It is with this view that psychotherapists so often set their agenda solely in terms of how to most effectively mitigate, if not terminate, the various forms of psychologically relevant human suffering. That such suffering may have profound spiritual and moral meaning receives little attention. And then he goes into what a Christian perspective on suffering would be, or an LDS perspective. So hedonism views suffering as bad in and of itself. However, having true compassion for others includes suffering with them. That's the point that Dr. Gant tries to make in his paper. Alleviating suffering of others often includes suffering with them, which is antithetical to the doctrine of hedonism and modern psychotherapy. One example I've seen is critics will often decry church programs like missions because they demand a lot of time and emotional labor and can include a great deal of pain and suffering. But what they don't realize is one of the reasons why missions are hard is because the missionary is stepping down from their privileged life and experiencing firsthand the pain and suffering of people living in third world countries, poor, ghetto, and dangerous neighborhoods. They experience family conflict, drug and alcohol addiction, gang violence, etc. These are things that like an LDS youth growing up in Layton, Utah wouldn't experience otherwise had he not gone on a mission. While we should not glory in needless suffering in and of itself, these missionaries are in a unique position to have compassion for these people, i.e. suffer with them, and they can offer them a new way of living that can improve their lives and alleviate their suffering. The suffering experienced during a mission can also be a major source of personal growth that can help that missionary develop high levels of social competence that they would not otherwise have gained otherwise. Sometimes the suffering experienced during a mission can become so great that it can impede a missionary's ability to function properly. There is certainly room for improvement in how we respond to this problem, but we shouldn't see the suffering experienced during a mission or in church service in general as bad in and of itself. And so critics will often say that the church demands a lot. It's a high demand religion, which causes suffering. It makes people uncomfortable. And while we shouldn't glory in needless suffering, we shouldn't see it as bad in and of itself. There are plenty of instances where suffering with people can help alleviate their suffering and can help us grow personally as well. And then to attack the argument of the critic from a logical point of view, I've often seen their arguments framed in this way. So premise 1, LDS Church teachings say X. Premise 2, critics interpret X to mean Y. And then premise 3, they assume that most Mormons must also interpret X to mean Y. And then they conclude that Y causes dangerous effects. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of logical leaps between all these premises. So a lot of them require data to support. Many of them don't even get the first premise right. They either misrepresent what the church teaches, or they cherry pick some obscure passage while ignoring what the overall message of the church has been since its founding on a particular subject. And then they interpret X to mean Y. They assume that members of the church must interpret it the way they interpret it. And then they assume that there's a causal relationship between that belief and some dangerous effect, depression rates, suicide rates. But they usually don't provide any data to back that up. It's just assumed that because the church doesn't align with the way they view the world, then Y must be harmful. This argument takes many forms depending on who it's coming from. For example, I've seen from Protestant Christians, your religion is a works-based religion, and that's why Mormons are all depressed. I actually saw this very argument on from Eric Johnson. I know you know who he is. He's from Mormon Research Ministry. He was on Apologia Utah, and he speculated that the reason why Mormons are all depressed is because we believe in a works-based religion.
Not to cut you off, but a friend who's an Anglican reached out to Mormon Research Ministry, Eric and Bill. Eric and Bill, I will happily debate you 2-on-1 on sola scriptura and baptismal regeneration, as Liam, the Anglican, asked for you to do. So just on that unrelated note, but you mentioned Johnson. So.
Yeah, I saw you say that in one of your posts, but and then this argument takes another form from ex-Mormons and sometimes progressive Mormons who say your religion holds to a very conservative sexual ethic or has a perfectionistic culture, and that's why Mormons are all sexually repressed and secretly addicted to pornography. When it comes to LGBTQ Latter-day Saints, you even have faithful Latter-day Saints who may be very progressive. They may believe in the church's truth claims regarding the Book of Mormon, but they think that the church is harmful towards sexual minorities. I think Jim Bennett would fit that description. He believes in the church's truth claims, but from a social scientific point of view, thinks that the church is harmful towards certain groups. And then they believe Mormons believe in traditional gender roles, and that's why it's a terrible place for women, without any data to back it up. And then a new one that I've encountered is from Mormon fundamentalists, especially from like the Doctrine of Christ folks. They'll say that the modern church is not following the doctrines originally laid out by Joseph Smith or Brigham Young. And that is why members are depressed, addicted to porn, and getting divorced. We're not fundamentalistic enough, and so we're being cursed by God or something like that. I even encountered someone say that they think that people who believe that polygamy was inspired of God are more likely to be addicted to pornography. It was one of the wildest claims that I've ever seen on the internet. So there are other criticisms that take this form, but the common theme behind all of them is that beneath that perfect looking Mormon facade is a dark underbelly where Mormons are secretly a bunch of depressed dupes who secretly engage in a multitude of degenerate behaviors. So on the outside, we all look like a big happy family who live perfect lives, but there's got to be something nefarious below the surface, and we're going to find out what it is. You see that from, I think it was Rolling Stone. They wrote an article about like how BYU students had crabs. I look it up. I'm not going to explain what that is, but just look up the article. It was really weird. They didn't really have anything to substantiate it, but there's always someone trying to look for something below the surface about how Mormons are doing weird stuff. So whenever a critic says that X is a problem in the church, I ask, compared to what? Their answers usually shock me. They say, I don't care about comparisons. The church hurt me, and that's all I care about. And then I've also heard that comparisons don't matter. The church harms, and that's all that matters. And I can't help but think this is a bit of special pleading. I don't think that they would apply this logic to other things like vaccines. Many of them have never thought to ask how the church compares to the general population or to other religious groups when they complain about the harm the church causes. This is an analogy that I used in my debate that you talked about earlier. But it says, I've met people who claim to have had very severe negative reactions to vaccines that have affected them for the rest of their lives. These same people will sometimes claim, based on their personal experience, that vaccines are harmful, and they will try to dissuade others from getting vaccinated. While I don't necessarily disbelieve these people's experiences, the data on vaccines overwhelmingly indicates that these severe reactions are very rare, and that our world's overall health would be much worse were there no vaccines. Because we know that vaccines are vastly more beneficial than harmful to the overall population, we have to find some other way to help the people that have been hurt by vaccines that doesn't include discontinuing their population-wide administration or attempting to undermine societal trust in vaccines. Likewise, when it comes to the church, the critic can't just rely on anecdotes or even a collection of anecdotes to show that the church harms people. We have to look at systematically gathered data of large populations to assess how the church fares compared to the general population. Critics that hyper-focus on marginal cases are no better than anti-vaxxers who rely on poor quality evidence to support their arguments. So now I'll get into a review of the reviews. So there have been 4 reviews of the literature on this subject, covering 60 years. And so forgive me if I'm not able to summarize 60 years of research and hundreds of studies, but I'll definitely highlight the most important parts. These studies reviewed include, but are not limited to, the following indices of mental health and general well-being: anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, marital satisfaction, divorce rates, and family life, premarital sexual patterns, self-esteem, irrational beliefs, self-reported happiness, and life satisfaction. They also include variables like delinquency, rates of drug and alcohol abuse, social competence, life expectancy, overall physical health, and risk of certain health conditions like cancer, asthma, or heart problems. In total, these reviews cover 158 studies that have been published between 1960 and 2022 in peer-reviewed journals. In the aggregate, these studies have hundreds of thousands of participants who come from a diverse set of backgrounds. For example, there were studies that included female, LGBTQ, Hispanic, and Polynesian samples. The last part is especially important because sometimes when I cite this data to critics, they'll say, yeah, well, that just means that the church is only true for straight white males. It isn't good for people of color or for women or LGBTQ members of the church. And as we'll see later, the research doesn't bear that out. So the first review was conducted by Dr. Daniel Judd. He's a professor at BYU. In 1998, he reviewed 55 studies from 1960 to 1995 that included at least one measure of mental health and one measure of Latter-day Saint affiliation, belief, or practice. 70% indicated a positive relationship, meaning greater mental health. 4% were negative, 24% were neutral, and 1% were curvilinear. These studies examined 73 outcomes. These outcomes included indices of mental health such as depression. And from his review, he said there is little support for the assertion that LDS religiosity is antithetical to mental health. And he also said the data indicated that LDS individuals who live their lives consistent with their religious beliefs experience greater general well-being, marital and family stability, and less delinquency, depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. Now that part's important because if you just use general affiliation to see the relationship between religiosity and mental health, sometimes you get a very weak relationship. But as you look at as you see the pattern, that the more dedicated a person is to their religion, the more likely they are to experience positive effects. So in the case of members of the church, the more involved they are in their church, the more they attend the temple, serve a mission, the more likely they are to experience the benefits of religiosity. The second review is by Jared Overton. It was a dissertation conducted in 2005. Overton reviewed the literature from 1995 through 2005. Overton's review yielded 37 studies examining 95 outcomes, focusing on the relationship between Latter-day Saint religiosity and variables such as family life, child sex abuse, sexuality, eating disorders, depression, suicide, racial prejudice, and ethnocentrism, and social competence. Latter-day Saints affiliation, belief, or practice was positively related to mental health in 71% of the studies, with 17% finding a negative relationship and 12% finding no significant relationship. Overton himself said, while limitations, exceptions, and lack of uniform conceptualizations exist in this literature, in general, the studies reviewed describe a fairly healthy, happy, religious, and growing LDS population. The third review is from Diego Cordero and Vedanta Romero. It's in 2017. They reviewed 19 studies published between 2005 and 2016. This review focused more on health rather than mental health. It included some indices of mental health, but it included, we'll get into that. But it says results show that following the restrictive Mormon doctrine generates beneficial effects for the health of LDS members. Habits related to toxics in foods, as well as social support from family and Mormon community, are an important basis for good health. This review emphasized general health rather than mental health and included risk indices like cancer, asthma, and diabetes. Most importantly, studies examining female and Hispanic populations in Utah found that the sense of community to the LDS Church provided, along with the benefits of living the Word of Wisdom, greatly benefited these populations. So the most recent review is by Justin Dyer. He's a professor at BYU. And Blake also did a good job at summarizing the findings of this review. So it reviewed 46 studies published from 2005 to 2022. Number one, it is unsurprising that studies find Latter-day Saints are less likely to use alcohol, tobacco, or illicit drugs, and are the least likely to experience the urge to drink alcohol in response to negative emotion. Greater religious activity for Latter-day Saints also predicts less substance use. Number two, at the bivariate level, Latter-day Saint adolescents had significantly lower rates of depression than those of other religions or no religion. The lowest depression levels were from males with authoritative fathers and high family religious practices. Number three, Latter-day Saints had lower levels of suicidality and non-suicidal self-injuries, though some of these differences disappeared when controlling for family and substance use factors. Now, some critics will say, well, it goes away once you control for those factors, but that doesn't mean that Mormonism doesn't do anything. That just shows that family and substance use factors are a mediating variable between Latter-day Saint religiosity and these results. And so these factors mediate those results and the causal relationship between them. Number four, the comparative research found that Latter-day Saint women had more positive views about their bodies and were less likely to have eating disorders than other women. Spiritual strength was negatively related to concern about appearance. Number five, at the bivariate level, scrupulosity was related to lower intrinsic spirituality, lower self-esteem, greater avoidance of God, and greater anxiety about God. And for those who don't know, scrupulosity is like OCD expressed in a religious form. You're obsessed with living every little rule that your religion has. Shame was related to less religious commitment, greater scrupulosity, experiencing less grace from God, and greater legalism. Number six, current active Latter-day Saints had better mental health than former Latter-day Saints. Another study found no difference between current and former sex and gender minority Latter-day Saints on self-esteem. Examining depression, another study found significant interactions where being an active Latter-day Saint buffered against the effects of internalized homophobia and identity confusion. It's important to note that with sexual minorities, that the evidence is mixed. However, the more rigorous the design of the study, the more likely it was to report positive effects for the LGBTQ members of the church. Many of the studies that reported negative effects included researchers like John DeLynn. And so anyone who wants to accuse like Justin Dyer of bias, because he conducted many of these studies on LGBTQ members as well in his review, since he's affiliated with BYU, many would accuse him of bias. However, the ones that report negative results have guys like John DeLynn, and no one's going to say that he doesn't have bias against the church. And it doesn't really matter who conducted it. If the study is conducted rigorously, then we should take its results seriously. It's also important to note that a meta-analysis that was conducted a few years ago by a researcher at Utah State, I believe he's from, a meta-analysis concluded that religiosity was overall associated with greater mental health among LGBTQ people in general. This wasn't about Latter-day Saints, it was just about religiosity in general. So Dyer's conclusions actually square with the general literature on religiosity and mental health among sexual minorities. So next we'll move on to sexual assault. I actually wrote an article about this in Public Square magazine, and you can check it out there. There's a link to it. It says the highlights of it are, according to 2 anonymous campus climate surveys conducted in 2017 and 2022, about 7.4%. About 7.4% of women at BYU experience some form of unwanted sexual contact. This is a stark difference from the numerous campus climate surveys conducted at other universities, which consistently report that anywhere from 19 to 25% of women experience unwanted sexual contact. Even LGBTQ plus students at BYU anonymously reported sexual assault victimization rates lower than the percentage for straight students at other universities at 17%. This is shocking considering that LGBTQ plus Latter-day students at other universities tend to report a rate of anywhere from 33 to 73%. Now, I got a little bit of static from critics on Twitter about my claims here. They say that the campus climate survey its methods weren't completely similar to that of other campus climate surveys, and so you can't compare them. I wrote a response on my blog, my Substack, about that. But if you don't trust the results of the survey, I decided to use criteria from the CDC, the risk factors for sexual assault. Like what risk factors need to be present in individuals and in groups in order for sexual assault to be more likely to happen. And so we'll go over that. The CDC just needs time to load. So these are the risk factors the CDC lists for sexual assault. And as you see, alcohol and drug use, delinquency, lack of concern for others, aggressive behavior and acceptance of violent behaviors, early sexual initiation, coercive sexual fantasies, preference for impersonal sex and sexual risk-taking, exposure to sexually explicit media, and so on and so forth. And if you read the research that I just got done reviewing, Latter-day Saint youth actually perform exceptionally well on basically all of these risk factors. The only one that could possibly be used by critics of the church is adherence to traditional gender role norms. But the church takes a much more like, benevolent sexist approach, what's it called? Just like putting women on a pedestal, treating them like queens type stuff. That's not when the CDC is listing this, they're talking more about hostile sexism towards women, not the benevolent sexism or the chivalry culture that is prevalent in the church, where we try to treat women respectfully and basically lay out the red carpet for them. We really value women as mothers and as wives and their unique contributions to the church. But if you just look at all of these, especially the one I want to hyper focus on is alcohol and drug use, because there's plenty of research showing that Latter-day Saints have lower alcohol and drug use, and that there is a very robust connection between party culture at universities, and sexual assault. So BYU is the driest campus in the country. You make the connection. There's a reason why we should accept the campus climate survey's results, because BYU students also perform very well on these risk factors. Also, when it comes to relational risk factors, family history of conflict and violence, child history of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, so on and so forth, Latter-day Saints actually perform exceptionally well on these as well. And we'll get into that in a future slide. But exposure to sexually explicit media, I also want to go into that. Earlier, I said that there's an accusation that Utah is the #1 consumer of pornography. This was actually debunked a long time ago. It's based upon one 2009 study. Gary Wilson from yourbrainonporn.com actually does a good job at debunking this. But the 2009 study, it used a really bad methodology. It used data from a subscription site. And turns out that most people don't get their porn from subscription sites. They get them from free tube sites, like Pornhub. And so when you look at data from Pornhub, you actually find that Utah is one of the lowest. According to Pornhub, it's 40th. And then according to other studies that use various methodologies, it's like anywhere from 40th to 50th in porn consumption. And then when you look at studies that examine Latter-day Saints specifically, or just religious people in general, and Wilson lists off dozens of studies here that examine that very thing, you find that highly religious people have lower rates of pornography consumption and addiction. So alcohol abuse, exposure to sexually explicit media, Latter-day Saints perform exceptionally well on those fronts. Okay, just waiting for it to load. Next, we have sexual abuse, and this is abuse of young kids, and we have evidence from the Boy Scouts of America. So Jennifer Roach wrote a great article for Public Square magazine examining the data here. She examined a database of the ineligible volunteer files that was created by the LA Times and can be viewed online. The oldest file goes back to 1947, and there are, and there are 5,400 of these files. So Jennifer Roach and Dr. Stephen Cranny, who is a statistician, analyzed 10% of these files based on a random sampling, so 540 files. Then they went to work reading and coding these files, a process that took over 40 hours. While Latter-day Saint church-affiliated troops made up 20 to 30% of all BSA troops, the proportion of Latter-day Saint abuse cases was far lower, 5.16% to be exact. And then there was another article written by Public Square magazine a little while back. It just looks at the raw data of all the cases that from the BSA that are being brought to the courts. And when we look at this data, when we look at the raw data from the BSA lawsuit, we find that before the church cut ties with the BSA in 2019, they made up about 20% of all scouts and 37% of all scout troops. Yet of the 84,000 cases being brought to the courts against the BSA, the church only makes up about 2.6 to 9.2% of these cases, depending on which source you consult. Even if we accept the highest estimate, the church is very much underrepresented when we compare the percentage of abuse cases to their actual representation in the BSA. And also for those who have experienced sexual abuse, there was a study conducted in 1997 by Proxy et al. They found that in a sample of 5,417 women, 13% had experienced sexual abuse of some kind as children. 286 of these women were LDS, and they had better mental health and were better able to overcome the effects of the abuse than non-religious women who had also been abused as children. So their religiosity enabled them to form a sense of resiliency in the face of the abuse that they faced when they were young. Now, regarding the data from Jennifer Roach and Stephen Cranny, critics will often say that, because the church suppresses or doesn't report these or discourages reporting, or these kids are they're not willing to report it, and so that's why the church has lower rates. And you really have to engage in special pleading. You have to hold the church to different standards than you would hold other organizations. Like, why should we assume that underreporting is a bigger problem in the church as compared to schools or other secular organizations or other religions? Why should we assume that this is an exceptional problem in the church? So the best thing to do is just to assume that underreporting is equal across the board, and so therefore these statistics are a good representation of abuse within the church. Now, any abuse is too much, but we should always ask compared to what. And when we compare the church to other religions and to the general population, there's evidence that they have significantly lower abuse rates. So when it comes to alcohol and drugs, Utah has the lowest percentage of alcohol-impaired traffic fatalities in the U.S. in 2019, and in a 2014 report, Utah has the lowest alcohol-attributed deaths in an 11-state analysis. It is also below the national average of reported binge drinking, reported drinking before driving, and DUI arrests. Evidence shows that these positive statistics stem from a combination of both the culture and the laws, both of which are influenced by the church via the word of wisdom and the church's lobbying for strict alcohol laws with the Utah legislature. And then the reviews of the literature that I summarized earlier also show that Latter-day Saints specifically have much lower rates of alcohol, drug, and tobacco use or abuse than the general population. And a shout out to the B.H. Roberts Foundation. They have a Q&A about alcohol and the church. You should check that out. They cited the research that I cited here in this slide. And then we have the economic benefits of the church. So in 2020, an article was published in the magazine American Affairs entitled Utah's Economic Exceptionalism by economist Natalie Gochnor. And she cites data showing that Utah has the lowest income inequality and some of the highest rates of social mobility in the country. Social mobility refers to the odds that a child will earn more than his or her parents did at the same age. Utah also has the highest levels of social capital in the country, and social capital refers to the network of relationships in a society that enables it to function effectively. Now, based on her review of the evidence, Gochnor concluded that these results are largely due to the LDS Church's influence on the conduct of its members. She also said that the compassionate conservatism is very alive and well within Utah culture and within Utah politics. It's a very small government, but they also have like a very civic duty within the culture to help those in need and to provide for those that need help. So I want to tackle one way that critics try to criticize the church is they try to use Utah as a proxy for Mormonism. So using Utah as a proxy for Mormonism isn't useless, but it needs to be supported with other evidence if you want to avoid committing the ecological fallacy. This fallacy assumes that what is true for a population is also true for a subgroup within that population. Now, many people will say that, well, Mormons make up the vast majority of the population of Utah, so it's just safe to assume that any trend within Utah is due to Mormonism. The problem is with this is that around 60% of Utah are members of the church. That's reducing rapidly as more people begin to immigrate into Utah. It's becoming a hotspot for people to move, and that no more than 40% are actually active in the church. And it's likely that's even lower. That's a very liberal estimate. Even if Utah has been shown to have problems, studies of active Latter-day Saints in Utah don't show that these problems are caused by the church. So Dr. Justin Dyer actually did a presentation on this. I'll go over his presentation. I can find it. There we go. So we'll use suicide rates as an example. So to start addressing Utah suicide, so we see that Utah is part of something called the suicide belt right here. And its suicides are actually considered average when you look at the states within the suicide belt. Now, why do these states have such high suicides? Well, it's been theorized by researchers that the higher elevation, also race plays an effect. So white and Native American racial groups tend to have the highest suicide rates within the country. And it turns out that in the Midwest, there's a high percentage of white and Native American people. There is high gun ownership. So guns make it easier to do the deed. Whereas where guns are not as available, then it's just harder to commit suicide. And there's a lot of rural areas in the Midwest. So it's very easy for a person to feel isolated and alone, and they have less access to mental health services. And so all these factors likely play a role in why the suicide belt has high suicide rates. Now, one thing that all of these states, one factor that they don't share is the LDS Church. So you have to look at, let's see if we can get a breakdown of this area by Latter-day Saints. So you see that according to here, percent Latter-day Saints in Utah, 69%, is actually lower than that as time has gone on. Idaho, 27%, so maybe you could say that the church has influence there. But then you have these states where they barely make up anything. So if we're going to say that high suicide rates in the Midwest are caused by anything, it's not by anything that's unique to Utah. It's something that's unique to this area. Now, if we want to compare that to, say, binge drinking in the US, if we look at the maps, sorry, it's loading. It's taking a little too long. There we go. So prevalence of binge drinking among adults above the age of 18, we see that even though Utah is surrounded by a bunch of states that have high binge drinking, it has very low. So we can safely guess that there is something unique to Utah, and that is the reason why it has such low binge drinking. And then we can show that studies in Utah show that the church does have an influence over not only the culture, but also the alcohol laws play a role as well. Sorry, this is taking a little too longer. So this paragraph here basically says what I just said, that you can't attribute suicide rates to the LDS Church, especially since we know that the research that I just cited shows that LDS youth and LDS people in general greatly benefit from being in the church. Also, when you break the state of Utah down by county, you don't actually see that the counties with a higher percentage of LDS members have higher suicide rates. It's actually Carbon County, which has a very low percentage of LDS members, that has the highest suicide rates, whereas Utah County, which has one of the highest percentage of LDS members, has some of the lowest suicide rates in Utah. And so when you compare Utah to the rest of the country, and then also when you break it down by county, we just don't see research that shows that these negative trends within Utah are due to the church. And this is an area that I actually have more expertise in, since my degree is in criminal justice. My PhD is in that as well. But to trace this back, modern criminological research on the relationship between religiosity and crime and delinquency can be traced back to Travis Hershey and Rodney Stark's 1969 study entitled Hellfire and Delinquency. After the study's publication, it became the subject of intense debate and speculation that is carried on to this day. In this study, Hershey and Stark came to the conclusion that a belief in punishment in the afterlife among juveniles had no relation to criminal behavior. They concluded that the church is irrelevant to delinquency because belief in the possibility of pleasure and pain in another world cannot now and perhaps never could compete with the pleasures and pains of everyday life. These findings were met with numerous positive and negative reactions, and many researchers rushed to replicate its findings. And it's interesting to note that criminologists were a little too eager to accept the findings of this one study. And I've read a lot of the criminological literature. There's very little that's said about the influence of religion on crime. It's usually sociologists that don't specialize in criminology, or psychiatrists that conduct the research that has shown that religiosity is negatively correlated with criminality. Within mainstream criminology, they barely even talk about it. And Byron Johnson, a Christian criminologist, says that there is a bias against religion within the field of criminology. After this study was published, it was kind of like, okay, the word's out that religion doesn't do anything to reduce crime. But however, there were some Latter-day Saint sociologists and scholars of religion at BYU, such as Bruce Chadwick, Steve Albrecht, and Brent Topp, who played a prominent role in challenging Hershey and Stark's initial conclusions using samples of LDS youth. All studies that I have seen of LDS youth show that they have significantly lower delinquency and crime rates than the general population and even other religious groups. So that's very important because studies examining other religious groups come to mixed findings. Sometimes they show that religiosity is negatively correlated with crime and delinquency. Sometimes they don't. But with Latter-day Saint populations, all the studies I've seen show that the more religious they are, the less likely they are to engage in crime, delinquency, drug abuse, etc. And so some good reviews of the literature. This book, More God, Less Crime, that just goes over the general literature written by Byron Johnson, who I mentioned earlier. He conducts a systematic review of all the literature that has been conducted thus far. It was published in 2011, so it's a bit dated. However, he does a good job at going over the history of the research in crime and delinquency and religiosity. And as time has gone on, there have been a lot of systematic reviews conducted and meta-analyses of hundreds of studies showing that religiosity is actually negatively correlated with criminality. So Hershey and Stark's initial conclusions have definitely been challenged, and I would argue have been refuted. This book here, Shield of Faith, written by Bruce Chadwick, Brent Topp, and Richard McClendon, reviews the evidence regarding crime and delinquency among LDS youth. And it's basically a culmination of several decades of research that they have conducted. They have LDS youth samples, various ones in Utah and Provo. They also have some youth in Eastern United States. They also have a sample from Mexico. And lastly, they did a sample in Great Britain. And this was to show that this phenomena just isn't just in the United States. It's also among members of the church in other countries as well. And they consistently found, using a multivariate regression analysis, that even when you control for many other factors like family structure and peers, that religiosity played, private and public religiosity played a prominent role in reducing crime and delinquency among LDS youth. Now, a multivariate regression analysis is basically where, like, to simplify it, that you have this data set, all these different variables, and these variables have to compete with each other to explain the variance within the regression analysis. And so if religiosity has to compete with all these different variables within the data set, and if all those other variables explain away the variance and religiosity doesn't explain anything, then that shows that religiosity doesn't play a role. And they found consistently that religiosity did play a role. This subject deserves a whole presentation by itself, but I'm just going to summarize the research, and then I'll let Dan McClellan actually summarize it. He could probably summarize it better than I can, but I'll show a few videos from him about the research on cult models and brainwashing. So critics will often use cult models and brainwashing as a way to bash on the church, to say that it's harmful. They'll say your church meets all the characteristics of the bite model. The bite model is a model created by Stephen Hassan back in the 80s. Basically, like if your church meets X, Y, and Z criteria, then it's a cult, or it's a high control group or high demand religion. And that those are warning signs that you should stay away, because if you join it, you could risk experiencing harm. It's important to note that the predictive validity of the model is assumed by these critics. They just assume that because a church meets these criteria, then it must be harmful, even though the predictive validity of the model has yet to be reliably demonstrated. The BITE model was initially based upon Stephen Hassan's qualitative interviews of people who have left new religious movements back in the 80s. His work is heavily based upon the work of Robert J. Lifton, Margaret Singer, Edgar Schein, Lewis Julian West, and all these people have problems on their own. Their work has been highly critiqued, and I'll get into that later. But so the first time that Hassan's BITE model was actually subjected to a quantitative analysis was in his 2020 dissertation, and that those findings have not been replicated. Like within psychology, in order for your model or your theory to be legit, you have to replicate it multiple times. You have to subject it to a meta-analysis. That has not been done with Stephen Hassan's BITE model. It's initially based upon qualitative interviews of people who left new religious movements. And that's one reason why cult experts have been highly critiqued by other scholars, is because they hyper focus only upon people who have left new religious movements, not the people who stay. And so, like that's a very biased way to look at it. And I think their rationale is, we're not going to study people who stay because they've been brainwashed. But that's a fallacious argument. You're trying to prove that brainwashing exists, but you're not going to study people who stay because they're brainwashed. There's highly problematic. Cult models are not seen as valid scholarly frameworks by the vast majority of scholars of religion from many different disciplines: sociology, psychology, psychiatry, religious studies, history, etc. Even among scholars that do accept cult models as legitimate scholarly frameworks, there is no agreement among them as to whether the mainstream LDS church meets the characteristics of a cult. So, like, there's a double whammy there. The model itself is not seen as legitimate. Even among scholars who do think it's legitimate, they're not sure if the mainstream LDS church fits its criteria. Cult experts mostly hyper focus on groups like Scientology or the Moonies, the Unification Church. Those religions are much more extreme than our religion, and so there isn't much conversation about the mainstream LDS church as to whether it fits the model. Only among ex-Mormon critics will you see this model being used frequently to bash against the church. So in the 90s, there was a bunch of court cases where basically the American Psychological Association and American Sociological Association all wrote amicus briefs in these court cases. I think the big one is US versus Fishman. They basically said that these models are bunk. They don't do a good job at explaining the data, that they should not be taken seriously within the courts. And I'll just let Dan McClellan explain the history of these movements, because he has even though he's controversial in LDS circles, he does a good job at explaining this clearly and succinctly. So I'll just let him explain. Sorry, my internet's being really slow today.
Hey everybody, I continue to see a lot of discussion on social media about cults, and I just want to remind you all that this is not a legitimate scholarly framework. Cult, brainwashing, mind control, deprogramming, these things were all abandoned by scholars back in the early 90s after the courts asked cult experts to substantiate their methods and their findings, and they failed entirely. This is why the only scholars you will see publishing on the concept of cult these days are scholars from the 80s who are trying to remain relevant. So Stephen Hassan's BITE model was developed back in 88. It was abandoned by scholars along with everything else, but after 9/11, after the rise of Trump, these scholars tried to ride that wave of populist anxiety back into the public eye. And this is harmful for a number of reasons, and not least of which, it complicates our attempts to understand what's actually going on with these groups that are causing significant harm.
Yeah, he has a series of videos on this. And he has like several exchanges with a lot of the ex-Mormon community. They really did not like this because they like his work when it comes to biblical scholarship, because it undermines the church's truth claims. But when he came out with these videos, this happened a while back, the ex-Mormon community really got angry with him. And
hey, happy to elaborate. The conceptualization of cult that I critique in my video is a product of the 1960s and the development of two social movements in tandem that were made up of parents who were upset about their teenage and adult children running off into the woods with hippies to talk about weird stuff. In the Christian community, you had the counter-cult movement. In the non-religious community, you had the anti-cult movement. And one of their priorities was finding a way to assert control over their adult children who could join any groups they wanted. And what they did to facilitate that was went to long since debunked research about Korean War POWs and how they had to have been brainwashed and been under mind control to sympathize with their captors. This has long since been debunked, but the counter and anti-cult movement gladly took up that research and said people who join with these weirdos in the woods cannot be of sound mind. They must have been brainwashed. They are under mind control. This allowed them to get medical professionals involved. It allowed them to commit people. It allowed them to take over control of the lives of their adult children, which was the goal all along. Now, because brainwashing isn't real, deprogramming, their method of reversing the effects of brainwashing, also wasn't real. So they were constantly having to escalate their techniques to try to make it work. And this resulted in the 80s with a bunch of kidnappings, with sexual abuse, with electroshock therapy, and a lot of harmful behavior that mirrored what they were criticizing in the cults themselves. So scholars began to become alarmed. They started to investigate the foundations of these frameworks and found out that there was nothing there. There was no scientific basis to brainwashing, to mind control. And the bottom fell out. The courts stopped allowing them to use brainwashing and mind control as a way to absolve themselves of responsibility for their actions. And by 1995, these movements were all but defunct, which is why you don't see scholars these days talking about cults and mind control, except for scholars like Stephen Hassan from the 80s trying to relive the glory days. The rise of Trump increased interest among lay people and society in general about cults, and this allowed him to ride that populist wave into a PhD program where he finally wrote his dissertation and got his PhD in 2020, even though the BITE model dates to the 80s. Now, this is not to say that such groups were not capable of harmful behavior and that there were not power dynamics and different techniques of manipulation that led to harmful behavior. There were absolutely such harmful behaviors, but the dynamics associated with them are not found in this conceptualization of cult. They're much broader, and we need to do better to understand them. Hey.
All right. So he does a good job at summarizing why cult models are problematic. And then the most ironic thing is that he talks about deprogramming. A lot of these deprogramming sessions to get people to leave new religious movements or cults, these deprogramming sessions had a lot of the same characteristics that they found so distasteful in these groups that they were critiquing. So they were essentially using brainwashing techniques that they found so distasteful on people to get them to leave these movements. And they've admitted this. And they basically say that the ends justify the means. And it really makes it clear that it's not really the techniques that these groups use, manipulation tactics. It's really the ideas that are being promoted that they disagree with, but they're using brainwashing or cult as kind of a pseudoscientific term to mask their own value judgments about these organizations. Occult scholars have tried to rebrand brainwashing as coercive persuasion or mental slavery, mind control, or coercive control. This is meant to give off the impression that they refined and changed their ideas to be more in line with the evidence, but it actually means the same thing, that you're not really changing it conceptually when you actually dig into it. As Dan said, there are groups that do commit significant harm, but cult models are not valid ways to understand how these harms are caused. Words like cult, brainwashing, and indoctrination are really just pseudoscientific terms meant to mask value judgments about a belief system or group that one doesn't like or that is culturally unpopular. Since they prioritize the accounts of people who have left new religious movements, they are at best accurate depictions of how former members perceive their former organization. However, the purpose of models is to predict things or explain the data with the fewest amount of assumptions as possible, and cult models have done neither. Again, the best thing they do is qualitatively explain how some former members perceive their organization. And sometimes those perceptions might be true. Maybe they grew up in a very totalitarian family that really pushed religion on them in a totalitarian way. Maybe they grew up in a bad ward that was coercive and stuff like that. But the model isn't a very good way at examining religions or organizations in general. And these are some good references about cult models and brainwashing. Massimo Intravigne has done a lot of good work. His book, Brainwashing, Reality or Myth, published by the Cambridge University Press, is probably the most recent work on this. It was published in 2022. Another one, Does Mental Slavery Exist?, is a much shorter summary of the history of the bite model, and cult models and brainwashing. Gordon Melton is a historian, and he goes over the history there as well. And then James Richardson, he's a psychiatrist. He goes over why, from a psychological point of view, cult models and brainwashing are problematic. And he provides alternative theories based upon social psychology that can better explain how these groups operate and how they get people to follow. And cult models tend to place way too much emphasis on the ability of the organization at the top or some omnipotent leader to coerce or persuade people to do what they want or control them. Whereas more accepted models tend to show that it is a combination of the individual and the group, and an interaction between the group and the organization itself. It's a complex interaction between those three different entities. And so people will often act in a certain way because they want to be a part of the group. They want to be accepted by the group, not necessarily because they're being coerced, but because they want to be accepted. People with certain personality factors are more likely to join. Personality traits are more likely to join these groups, and personality is highly genetic. So there's a lot on the individual level that plays a role. So again, cult models place too much emphasis on the organization or the omnipotent leader itself, whereas other models are much more nuanced and complicated. Lastly, all the research that I've summarized here pertaining specifically to Latter-day Saints, it squares quite well with the general literature on religion and health. This book here is going to be the third edition of the Handbook of Religion and Health. It's edited by Harold Koenig. He's a psychiatrist, Tyler Vanderweel, and John Petit. It hasn't been released yet. It's going to be released, I think, in September. but it's going to be 1,200 pages long. But Harold Koenig has done a lot of great work. He's done a good job at summarizing the literature on this subject. The last edition of this book was published in 2012, and it reviewed thousands of studies. And this is an excerpt from the abstract of his summary of the last edition of this book. He says, this paper provides a concise but comprehensive review of research on religion and spirituality and both mental health and physical health. It is based on a systematic review of original data-based quantitative research published in peer-reviewed journals from between 1872 and 2010, including a few seminal articles published since 2010. Then I reviewed research on religion and spirituality and mental health, examining relationships with positive and negative mental health outcomes, where positive outcomes include well-being, happiness, hope, optimism, gratefulness, and negative outcomes involve depression, suicide, anxiety, psychosis, substance abuse, delinquency, crime, marital instability, and personality traits. I then explain how and why religion and spirituality might influence mental health. Next, I review research on religion and spirituality and health behaviors such as physical activity, cigarette smoking, diet, and sexual practices, followed by a review of relationships between religion and spirituality and heart disease, hypertension, cerebral vascular disease, Alzheimer's disease and dementia, immune functions, endocrine functions, cancer, overall mortality, physical disability, pain, and somatic symptoms. So he really covers his bases. It's just a general religion and health review, and it covers thousands of studies. And I've read the review. It is overwhelmingly positive. The more religious a person is, it's mostly within a Christian context, but the more religious a person is, the healthier they are in physical health, mental health, emotional health, economic health, social health. And so the data I reviewed pertaining to Latter-day Saints squares with the general literature here. And that's very important. And that concludes my presentation.
Yeah, that was really helpful. I do appreciate the work that went into that, and hopefully the people who will listen to this episode will appreciate it as well. Especially with the bibliography you recommended as well. They seem like very interesting books.
Yes, yeah, I've been reading a lot on it recently, and so I'm not very knowledgeable about the apologetics that you're used to engaging in, scripture, church history. I have a working knowledge of it, probably more than the average member. But I figured since I'm going into criminal justice, social sciences, I might as well use that as an opportunity to look into that, religion and mental health, religion, crime, and delinquency. And it's been very fun, and I've loved looking into it.
Yeah, and I will also appreciate the fact you actually referenced Stephen Cranny's work as well. He's done a lot of very good work, especially his background as a statistician. So, But no, that's perfect. In the show notes, I'll include like some links that B.H. Roberts have produced, including some of the ones that you referenced. And yeah, I'll also include like in the show notes your debate where you went through like some mental health statistics as well. So yeah, I really do appreciate the time you went on to this, and thanks again for your time, Jacob.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.